Do you feel like you're going nowhere in life?
There's a certain desired feeling when capturing a dialogue scene in a commercial or film. A scene can be captured in a variety of ways to get a point across. But where do you even begin to shoot a scene properly? And what steps as a cinematographer do you need to take? In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how you can capture a dialogue scene by going over my step-by-step process as a cinematographer. We're going to be going over a fashion commercial that we released, go over some lighting diagrams, and everything in between. The first thing I ask myself when shooting a scene is, how can I maximize the number of different feeling shots in this one scene? I like to refer to this technique as coverage, and once I started implementing this into all my work, everything changed. After considering what type of feeling you want to portray in the scene, it's all about covering your bases so you can get the director's point across in the best light. This can be in the form of shot variation, cutaways, details in the room, and so much more. Instead of just talking about it, I'm going to go over a practical example where I'm going to guide you on a step-by-step process on how to shoot a scene properly. The scene that we're going to be looking at today is from a fashion film that we released, and in this fashion film, we have a main driving scene that I've cut for here so we could just look at each shot specifically, and this drives the entire piece in terms of a therapy scene. We have multiple worlds built out in this commercial, and the thing I wanted to cover in terms of something that was new to me is shooting a dialogue scene in a commercial. This is rarely seen. You only have one-liners or something like that, but in this commercial we actually have interaction between the therapist and our main talent here. But the main talent doesn't say anything. He just expresses his feelings through his emotions and the way we portray that through our camera angles as well as movements. The only person talking in this scene is actually the therapist here. So the first thing that I want to go over is how you cover a scene properly just in terms of shots. So in this scene, we shot this over this span of 3 hours, and we were dealing with a naturally lit daylight scene. And as you can see in the beginning, we actually have some cutaways of him tapping his finger, and then just some cutaways of the actual fashion pieces that were in the piece. And then we have our main dolly in here. Then we have a different variation where we cut back after another scene, which is essentially the same shot, but just at a different angle. And then we have a cutaway of him writing out something, again, back to the scene, and then him tapping his pencil, a whip pan to a reaction, and a whip pan back. And then in this, we have him feeling uncomfortable. That is portrayed by the Dutch angle and him sitting like that. And then we have this push into his final eye here, and then the final reveal of the actual logo. So I'm going to start with the wide, and whenever I light anything, I always start with my widest shot. Even when I'm shot listing a scene, even though it's not the first thing I see in the edit, I'm going to shoot this in terms of the hardest shot to start off the day. You can start off with the easiest shot in terms of how everybody feels to get everybody warmed up, but in terms of a technical standpoint, I always start with the hardest shot so we can move in and I can do everything else. And usually the hardest shot is the wide. So we are dealing with a naturally lit scene, and when we scouted this whole project, we wanted to shoot in this corner because it just gives us so much interest and so many leading lines in terms of a frame inside of a frame, and then everything pointing directly at what we're looking at. And this was a beautiful location and property that we were able to shoot at. And this was around, like, I would say 10 o'clock we started shooting this, so we wanted to have that early morning, midday feel. And whenever choosing a shooting direction, I always like to backlight my subjects, and I like to shoot into windows. A lot of people get afraid of shooting into windows because you have to compensate in terms of adding light to the scene, and I always like to shoot into windows with that challenge in tail. So when I look in the scene where I'm trying to motivate my lights from, I am going to choose the outdoors and give it that early morning feel, because if I just look at the exposure difference from outside to inside, naturally without any lights, that's where our lighting direction is going to be dictated from. So it's coming from the outside. This frost here was natural from the glass that's already there, so we didn't add anything or to try to hide anything. This just worked out just to the location. It was like a home built in the 60s, so it has a lot of this character to it. And then on the right here, beside this bookshelf, there is an actual open door, and you can see that through some of this here. That's going to be important later when I start talking about the lights. And because it's morning, I wanted to play up on this fact that we have lights blasting through these windows. And up here behind our main talent, I have an aperture 600D, and that is daylight balance, so that's set to 5600 Kelvin. And then this is shooting through the window, and this is giving me this highlight that we see here and completely backlighting our subject and giving us some interest on the floor, as well as bringing up some highlights in the edges of his pants, as well as the edges of him, his chair, and spilling onto this shelf here. And then behind this door, we have an aperture 1200D, and that is shooting through here, daylight balance, so that gives us 5600 Kelvin. And this is shooting in this way, and then you can see that hard cut of light. So this is acting as a kind of a big key light, and then giving us a bigger spread and putting the light everywhere in terms of our subject, as well as lifting the room in general. So it appears like that's the sun coming through, and that's what I wanted to do. A lot of people assume that you can just have a big source of light outside, but I like these little highlights that are coming through other places from the window. When you look at the sun, it's so far away and it's so spread out, so it hits all of the window. But when you have a light that's almost as far as away in terms of putting it at ground and backing out across the house, you're not going to get the same effect. So I had to have multiple light sources, and this is what cinematographers and directors of photography usually do. They have a big source that is filling up the room and brightening and acting as your main key, and then you have other little sources of light with spotlight mounts and everything that give you those hard edges and highlighting looks like that we have the sun outside, because this is what the sun would naturally look at. And then we wanted to add some texture and some interest back into the frame in terms of the practicals. So we have a B7C bulb here. It's not really lighting anything because it's at a low percentage, but it gives us some detail back into this and gives us that warm glow. So we have those at 2700 Kelvin. This is just me naturally implementing color contrast. Usually with these lighting fixtures, I like to do that in terms of having them at a very warm color, not necessarily cool, because usually they're at that. And then we have another one here, and that's a B7C bulb. So I'll put that B7C, and this is set at 2700 Kelvin as well, giving us this nice highlight here of orange because the floor is very reflective, and we also cleaned it beforehand to give us that. And then it's just highlighting the stuff that we have here, which is very nice. Whenever I look at that side, I'm like, ooh, that's not distracting, but it is interesting and it highlights it even more. I like to add multiple fixtures in terms of bringing up certain areas and everything like that, and that will be seen in another shot where we have a 60B implemented here as well. So these were the lights. Naturally, there was a room on the other side with big windows as well, and that was providing a lot of fill back into the room, and I didn't have to add any negative fill in terms of flopping off the left side of this. I just have a bunch of light coming in from the right side with a 600D and a 1200D, and that gave me enough contrast that I didn't have to add any negative fill back. And the way we achieve this, because if you look at the shot, we're actually moving through the space and we see the floor. You wouldn't be able to achieve this with a normal Dana Dolly setup. And what we did is we used a overhead piping setup. I had my key grip set up, a stand here and a stand here. If you visualize, this is the corner of the room, and then an overhead here, and then a stand in the back. And this allows the camera to be placed so you don't see the track at all. So if we were to do an overhead view of that, this is the corner that we're shooting into. This is the stand here. This is another stand here. Then we have the pipe, and then the T-bar section, and then another stand over here, and the camera sits in between that. I love to do this setup because it's easy and simple. I don't need a doorway dolly or floor tracker or anything like that. This is just working with the budget we have in hand, and then usually you mount the camera upside down. It's pretty inconvenient in terms of setups and everything like that, but it's super fast and cheap to do in terms of working with budgets. And going from this wide, we're going to look at this, and you can see kind of those lighting fixtures in play and everything that's going on here. It's very important to consider continuity at these points. I'll just point out some of the mistakes of ourselves. During breaks of this, we'd have our talents to obviously take water and take breaks, and there's a water bottle sitting there, but it's such a quick shot that you don't really notice it, and this bulb actually died on us, so there's no orange spill or anything happening there. But the lighting fixture that we did add here is this little pool of light here that's also hitting onto this. And this was just a 60B with a spotlight mount by Nanlite. So there's my little light fixture, and then on top of that there is a spotlight, and that's just giving a little interest back into the frame. Obviously it doesn't make sense in terms of the lighting is coming this way, but we mimicked it so it was looking like it was coming from here. But you can see that some of the highlights get into here, and that really doesn't make sense in terms of lighting direction, but it's something that you don't really notice. And we didn't have enough powerful source or a light to get up in there in terms of painting that down. You can see that's the 600D is doing our magic here and lighting our subject here, and then we have the 1200D which is shooting through here and it's lighting our other subject or supporting talent here. So it was just another light that we added in terms of this wide. and you can see that B7 bulb is on there through the highlights that we see up there. Now past this is the last wide we kind of see, and we move in for some mediums and types. And this is when we start looking at coverage. So the first ones that I'm going to look at are the first ones in the sequence. And what I love about shooting my wide first is I can just move in for my tights, and I don't necessarily need to add any more lights in terms of moving anything. And the reason I always do my wides first is because when I move in for my tights, all I have to do is add a little light and some negative fill. My room tone and everything has already been set, and also I set my look. Now we're moving in some detailed and beauty shots. I'm not going to keep it as harsh. I'm going to make it look more commercial and more soft and everything like that. So these two shots, we just had to move in camera, obviously. And then I am using the Amaran F22, and this is set at 3200 Kelvin, a little warmer. I like using warmer light sources when going in for tights to light black skin subjects, because it just highlights it even more. The F22 has a layer of diffusion as well as another layer of diffusion as well as the grid, so we're not killing spill, but we're not necessarily worried about spill here, and that's just set at a low percentage, giving some highlight back into this and some softness. And then here I just have a 4x4 floppy, and that's opened up to give me a 4x8, and this is adding a bunch of contrast back into the image. We're dealing with a lot of contrast in terms of color, and we wanted to match that color as in the shirts and everything like that. So we wanted to match that in terms of the feel of not muting it at all, in terms of being like really lifted. We wanted to have really deep and rich shadows, so that's why I added negative fill back into this one. And then if we go into this scene, it's the exact same setup in terms of having that negative fill there, and as well as the Amaran F22 there. The window is actually of the door is seen in the background here, and obviously it's very like, oh, what is that? You can assume it's a window. The 1200D was blasting through this, so I had my gaffer just turn that off, and then the 600D is still sparked on this side, and that gives us that nice highlight here. So I really like that color contrast between the two, and I've established a shadow side, so I want to keep that side of the image dark and not have anything distracted. So these are just inserts that we got while our talent was sitting there while we were shooting some of the tighter shots in terms of him thinking and everything like that. I would love to get more inserts of the room, because in the beginning of the edit we use like a ticking sound for a clock, but we just didn't have time, and these were the max amount that we could get in terms of just finishing off the piece. And this is just an over the shoulder shot, and we didn't really add any of the lights here. I have that F22 set up, but we sparked it and it felt too unnatural because it was filling all this side of the paper, and we wanted to keep that natural shadow and keep it consistent from the scenes that we have beforehand. So we wanted that harsh look here, but when we were highlighting the clothes and everything, we had that, you know, warm look and soft look when highlighting that stuff. And then this was pretty interesting because we couldn't have any lights or fixtures placed on this side because we would see a stand. So we had to keep that clear and keep it as naturally as looking as possible. So what we did, I'll start with our therapist here. When we do the whip, you can see that light fixture is still on. It's not really doing much. It's just adding some warmth back into his shirt. But what we had to do here is add a hair light. And then we used a little nanolite pavo tube. And this was set at 2700 Kelvin just to give that warmth and color contrast back. And this was really it. We had to add some negative fill too. We have a floppy here, and that's opened up, giving some negative fill back into his shoulder as well as his face. And then that pavo tube is just acting as a hair light, as well as giving some detail back into the chair. So this is what I like to call the natural checkerboard in terms of light and dark. And then here we looked out because we had a massive window on this side, and then that was being my key source. As we were looking back to the main location, we have that giant window on that side. So that's what I was playing up on in terms of amplifying this and giving that harsh look in terms of the sun. This is consistent with the other looks and everything like that, but we are dealing with something that's a little more blue, and this is just due to the white balance that I set at my camera. So the white balance is 4400 Kelvin for this scene specifically, and that means my orange sources are gonna look less orange, but my daylight balance will look a little blue, and that's what you can see here. And then we even push that further in color just to give that natural color contrast of what we're looking for. And then you can see that those highlights popping off in his pen, his shirt, and the edges of everything. And it's just giving us that nice checkerboard that we're always looking for. And then now if we go to the other one, we are dealing with somebody that is on the opposite side of our shadow. And we had to develop some contrast back into the face. We're using all the fixtures that we had before, but I thought he needed a little more boost on this side because all the lights that are coming in from the back are backlighting him and acting as a big hair light. So we have that 4x8 floppy, just adding contrast. And then we had the Amaran F22 boomed out overhead so that we could light him, and the stand was behind us. And this is giving that warmth and that wrap back into his face. So those big fixtures are on the outside still in play, and you can see that with the harsh edge light that is coming from here and bouncing across the room, and then even the hair light that is coming from here and just blowing out the background, which I really like in this, and it gives you that punchy and contrasty look. The F22 is set at 3200 Kelvin, and my camera's white balance is still at 44. And that gives us that contrast that we were looking for before. And then this is the same shot. Now we used a bunch of different focal lengths, and this is the main concept I want to talk about in terms of coverage, is get so much variety in terms of your focal lengths as well. We were shooting on lots of wides, and when we went for in the mediums and tights, it was like on a 50 to 35. But this we backed up all the way and shot on like a 135 to give you that compression as well as give a different look. So when you hop back to the scene, we are intentionally supposed to feel something. We're on a Dutch, our talent is uneasy, and we are as a viewer as uneasy as well. And that just gives you that feeling. And we have the therapist chair here in the foreground to give us some context. And we are truly immersed in terms as a viewer at this point. And this is what I really like to do in terms of asking the director and talking to him in terms of like, hey, how are we supposed to be feeling right now? But I kind of messed up in terms of this shot back to these ones, as I can see here. If you look on his face, he has a naturally warm glow. That's due to the F22 that we had set up before. But in this scene, this was one that we kind of shot off on the hip, meaning that we didn't really plan it. We're just running through it in terms of switching lenses and getting coverage. I didn't realize is that his face feels kind of flat here. He feels like he's getting lost in the shadows, and this is what we were shooting during the coverage during the wide. We didn't really move in for those tights yet, and I really didn't have that F22 set up. So that's like something, if I were to do this again, I would add that in terms of adding some interest back onto his face. This still is a great shot, and I really like the highlights that are coming off here, and it feels very natural. But in terms of having more light on his face, that would be more commercial and keep it consistent throughout the look that we're trying to portray here. This is very beautiful. This is very lit nicely. This is very commercial in terms of how something would look. So this is just something to consider as well when you're doing these scenes, is continuity in terms of action, things in the frame, feeling, as well as, especially as a cinematographer and director of photography, lighting. And then we move into this, and that's the same setup that we were talking about before in terms of this scene with that F22. As you can see, it's very similar, and this is our outlier here. And then we go in for a macro with a zoom lens, and then into this shot here. And this is supposed to feel very intentional and very, oh, I'm only focusing on what is in frame. So we didn't really like this heavily in terms of having a bunch of detail on his back. We kind of vignetted this out in post. It was the same lighting setup that we had when he was doing this, but we mostly focused on what he is in the center. And we did that in a big way with the vignetting in post. But you can see that hair light that is still there, as well as it lighting up certain parts of his finger, as well as the top of the pen. And then we have our key light, which is that F22 lighting our paper. This project was shot on a mini LF in combination with signature primes. So these are very clean, very commercial, very contrasty lenses. And then this shot was shot on a Optimode 25 to 250, which is a super 35 lens, but we cropped in with the mini LF and gave us this zoomed in look that we can get on terms of getting all the way to the page. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more cinematography breakdowns, let us know in the comments below. And if you want to see a video similar to this where we break down a full car commercial, I have a video linked up here.